Hey kiddos, I missed you guys already. I told you I would make this YouTube channel so you could listen to me read the story. So what I'm gonna do is I'm going to read a chapter at a time. So each new video is going to be another chapter. And I'm so excited that we get to read this together because this is my favorite one, The Ersatz Elevator, and I haven't read it since I was your age. And so I'm so excited to get to read it again because it's a really, really good one. They're finally in like a cool house, but I guess you could guess what's going to happen. So I'm gonna get started with chapter 1. For Beatrice, when we met, my life began. Soon afterwards, yours ended. Remember who Beatrice is. Lemony Snicket's love. Here's the picture. You guys can have your book out with me. Chapter 1. The book you're holding in your 2 hands right now, assuming that you are in fact holding this book, and that you have only 2 hands, is one of the 2 books in the world that will show you the difference between the word nervous and anxious. The other book, of course, is the dictionary. And if I were you, I would read that book instead. Like that book, the dictionary shows you the word nervous means worried about something. You might feel nervous, for instance, if you served prune ice cream for dessert, because you'd be worried that it would taste awful. Whereas the word anxious means troubled by disturbing suspense, which you might feel if you were served a live alligator for dessert, because you would be troubled by the disturbing suspense about whether you would eat your dessert or it would eat you. But unlike this book, the dictionary also discusses words that are far more pleasant to contemplate. The word bubble is in the dictionary, for instance, as is the word peacock, the word vacation, and the words the author's execution has been canceled, which make up a sentence that is always pleasant to hear. So if you were to read the dictionary rather than this book, you could skip to the parts about nervous and anxious, and read about things that would keep you up all night long, weeping and tearing out your hair. But this book is not the dictionary, and if you were to skip the parts about nervous and anxious in this book, you'd be skipping the most pleasant sections in the entire story. Nowhere in this book will you find the words bubble, peacock, vacation, or unfortunately for me, anything about an execution being canceled. Instead, I'm sorry to say, you will find the words grief, despair, and woeful, as well as the phrases dark passageway, count all off in disguise, and the Baudelaire orphans were trapped, plus an assortment of miserable words and phrases that I cannot bring myself to write down. In short, reading a dictionary might make you feel nervous because you would worry about finding it very boring. But reading this book will make you feel anxious because you will be troubled by the disturbing suspense in which the Baudelaire orphans find themselves. And if I were you, I would drop this book right out of your 2 or more hands and curl up with the dictionary instead. Because all the miserable words that I'm about to describe these unfortunate events are about to reach your eyes. I imagine you must be nervous, Mr. Poe said. Mr. Poe is a banker who had been put in charge of the Baudelaire orphans following the death of their parents in a horrible fire. I'm sorry to say that Mr. Poe has not done a very good job so far, and that the Baudelaires had learned that the only thing they could rely on with Mr. Poe was that he always had a cough. Sure enough, as soon as he finished his sentence, he took out his white handkerchief and coughed into it. The flash of white cotton was practically the only thing the Baudelaire orphans could see. Violet, Klaus, and Sunny were standing with Mr. Poe in front of an enormous apartment building on Dark Avenue, a street in one of the fanciest districts in the city. Although Dark Avenue was just a few blocks away from where the Baudelaire mansion had been, the 3 children had never been to this neighborhood before. And they had assumed that the dark in Dark Avenue was simply the name and nothing more. The way a street named George Washington Boulevard does not necessarily indicate that George Washington lives there, or the way that 6th Street has not been divided into 6 equal parts. All right, guys, I want you to listen to the detail I just said. Although Dark Avenue was just a few blocks away from where the Baudelaire mansion had been. Okay? So they're in the city again. Very close to where they used to live. All right, I'm going back. I'm on page 5, if you guys are following along. Rather than street lamps placed at regular intervals along the sidewalk were enormous trees, the likes of which the children had never seen before, and which they could scarcely see now. High above a thick and prickly trunk, the branches of the trees drooped down like laundry hung out to dry, spreading their wide, flat leaves out in every direction, like a low, leafy ceiling over the Baudelaire's heads. This ceiling blocked out all the light from above, so even though it was the middle of the afternoon, the street looked as dark as evening, if a bit greener. It was hardly a good way to make the orphans feel welcome as they approached their new home. "You have nothing to worry about," Mr. Poe said, putting his handkerchief back in his pocket. "I realize some of your previous guardians have caused a little trouble, but I think Mr. and Miss Squalor will provide you with a proper home." "We're not nervous," Violet said. "We're too anxious to be nervous." "Anxious and nervous mean the same thing," Mr. Poe said. "And what do you have to be anxious about anyway?" "Count Olaf, of course," Violet replied. Violet was 14, which made her the eldest Baudelaire child, and the one with them who was most likely to speak up to adults. She was a superb inventor, and I'm certain that if she had not been so anxious, she would have tied her hair up in a ribbon to keep it out of her eyes while she thought of an invention that could brighten up her surroundings. "Count Olaf," Mr. Poe said dismissively. "Don't worry about him. You'll never find him here. Or he'll never find you here." The three children looked at one another and sighed. Count Olaf has been the first guardian Mr. Poe had found for the orphans, and he was a person as shady as Dark Avenue. He had a long eyebrow, a tattoo of an eye on his ankle, and two filthy hands that he hoped to use to snatch away the Baudelaire fortune that the orphans would inherit as soon as Violet came of age. The children had convinced Mr. Poe to remove them from Olaf's care, but since then, the Count had pursued them with a dogged determination, a phrase which here means everywhere they went, thinking up treacherous schemes and wearing disguises to try and fool the children. "It's hard not to worry about Olaf," Klaus said, taking off his glasses to see if it was easier to look around the gloom without them. "Because he has our Sorry, guys. Let me figure out this word. Compatriots, which is a fancy word for friends. Klaus was referring to the Quagmire triplets, whom the Baudelaires had met while they were attending boarding school. Duncan Quagmire was a reporter and was always writing down useful information in his notebook. Isadora Quagmire was a poet and used her notebook to write poetry. The third triplet, Quigley, had died in a fire before the Baudelaire orphans had the opportunity to meet him. But the Baudelaires were certain that he would have been as good a friend to his siblings. Like the Baudelaires, the Quagmires were orphans, having lost their parents in the same fire that claimed their brother's life. And also, like the Baudelaires, the Quagmires had been left an enormous fortune, in the form of the famous Quagmire sapphires, which were very rare and valuable jewels. But unlike the Baudelaires, they had not been able to escape Count Olaf's clutches. Just when the Quagmires had learned some terrible secret about Olaf, he had snatched them away, and since then, the Baudelaires had been so worried that they had scarcely slept a wink. Whenever they closed their eyes, they saw only the long black car that had whisked the Quagmires away, and they heard the only sound of their friends shrieking one fragment of the dreadful secret they had learned. "VFD," Duncan had screamed just before the car raced away, and the Baudelaires tossed and turned and worried for their friends, and wondered where in the world VFD could stand for. "You don't have to worry about the Quagmires either," Mr. Poe said confidently, "at least not for much longer. I don't know if you happen to read the Mortuary Money Management newsletter, but I have some very good news about your friends." "Gavu?" Sonny asked. Sonny was the smallest Baudelaire orphan and the youngest Baudelaire orphan and the smallest too. She was scarcely larger than a salami. This size was useful for her age, but she had 4 teeth that were larger and sharper than those of any other baby I'd seen. Despite the maturity of her mouth, however, Sonny usually talked in a way most people found difficult to understand. By Gavu, for instance, she meant something along the lines of, "The Quagmires have been found and rescued?" And Violet was quick to translate so Mr. Poe would understand. "Better than that," Mr. Poe said. "I've been promoted. I am now the bank's vice president in charge of orphan affairs. That means that I'm in charge not only of your situation, but of the Quagmire situations as well. I promise that I will concentrate a great deal of my energy on finding the Quagmires and returning them to safety. Or my name isn't..." Here, Mr. Poe interrupted himself to cough once more into his handkerchief, and the Baudelaires waited patiently until he finished. "Poe. Now, As soon as I drop you off, I am taking a 3-week helicopter ride to a mountain peak where the quagmires have been spotted. It will be very difficult to reach me during that time, as the helicopter has no phone. But I will call you as soon as I get back with the younger pals. Now, can you see the number on this building? It's hard for me to tell if we're at the right place. I think it says 667, Klaus said, squinting in the dim green light. Then we're here, Mr. Poe said. Mr. and Miss Squalor live in the penthouse apartment of 667 Dark Avenue. I think the door is here. All right, guys, so you know I used to live in New York City. And in New York City, they have really tall buildings. Skyscrapers is what they're called. And Nashville has a few that are tall, but a lot of hotels also have penthouses. So penthouses is the biggest room on the top of the building. They save the biggest room for the very, very top. And usually it is very, very big, very extravagant. The penthouse is where everyone wants to live. It's where a lot of celebrities live. It's where a lot of celebrities stay when they're at hotels. So keep that in mind. So they're going to the penthouse. No, it's over here, said a dark, scratchy voice. Let me start over. I'm on chapter 11, about midway down. No, it's over here, said a high, scratchy voice out of the darkness. The Baudelaires jumped a little in surprise and turned to see a man wearing a hat with a wide brim and a coat that was much too big for him. The coat sleeves hung over his hands, covering them completely, and the brim of his hat covered most of his face. He was so difficult to see that it is no wonder that the children hadn't spotted him earlier. Most of our visitors find it hard to spot the door, the man said. That's why they hired a doorman. Well, I'm glad they did, Mr. Poe said. My name is Poe, and I have an appointment with Mr. and Miss Squalor to drop off the new children. Oh, yes, the doorman said. They told me you were coming. Come on in. The doorman opened the door of the building and showed them inside to a room that was as dark as the street. Instead of lights, there were only a few candles placed on the floor, and the children could scarcely tell whether it was a large room or a small room that they were standing in. My, it's dark in here, Mr. Poe said. Why don't you ask your employers to bring in a good, strong halogen lamp? We can't, the doorman replied. Right now, dark is in. In what? Violet asked. Just in, the doorman explained. Around here, people decide whether something is in, which means it's stylish and appealing, or out, which means it's not. And it changes all the time. Why, just a couple of weeks ago, dark was out and light was in, and you should have seen this neighborhood. You had to wear sunglasses all the time or you'd hurt your eyes. Dark is in, huh? Mr. Poe said. Wait until I tell my wife. In the meantime, could you show us to where the elevator is? Mr. and Miss Squalor live in the penthouse apartment, and I don't want to walk all the way up to the top floor. Well, I'm afraid you'll have to. The doorman said there's a pair of elevator doors right over there, but they won't be of any use to you. Is the elevator out of order? Violet asked. I'm very good with mechanical devices, and I'd be happy to take a look at it. That's a very kind and unusual offer, the doorman said, but the elevator isn't out of order. It's just out. Stairs are in. The neighborhood decided that elevators were out, so they had the elevator shut down. Stairs are in, so there's still a way to get to the penthouse. Let me show you. The doorman led the way across the lobby, and the Baudelaire orphans peered up at a very long curved staircase made of wood, with metal banisters that curved alongside. Every few stops, they could see someone had placed more candles, so the staircase looked like nothing more than curves of flickering lights, growing dimmer as the staircase went farther and farther up, until they could see nothing at all. I've never seen anything like this, Klaus said. It looks more like a cave than a staircase, Violet said. Pincy, Sonny said, which meant something like, or outer space. It looks like a long walk to me, Mr. Poe said, frowning. He turned to the doorman. How many floors does this staircase go? The doorman's shoulders shrugged underneath his coat. I can't remember, he said. I think it's 48, but it might be 84. I didn't know buildings could be that high, Klaus said. Well, whether it's 48 or 84, Mr. Poe said, I do not have time to walk you children all the way up. I will miss my helicopter. You will have to go up by yourself and tell Mr. and Miss Squalor that I send my regards. We have to walk up by ourselves? Violet said. Just be glad you don't have any of your things with you, Mr. Poe said. Miss Squalor said there was no reason to bring any of your old clothing, and I think it's because she wanted you to save the effort of dragging suitcases all the way up those stairs. You're not going to come with us? Klaus asked. I simply don't have the time to accompany you, Mr. Poe said, and that is that. The Baudelaires looked at one another. The children knew, as I'm sure you know, that there is usually no reason to be afraid of the dark. But even if you are not particularly afraid of something, you might not want to get near it. And the orphans were a bit nervous about climbing all the way up to the penthouse without an adult walking beside them. If you're afraid of the dark, Mr. Poe said, I suppose I could delay my search for the Quagmires and take you to your new guardians. No, Klaus said quite quickly. We're not afraid of the dark, and finding the Quagmires is much more important. Oh, Bog, Sunny said doubtfully. Just crawl as long as you can, Violet said to her sister. And then Klaus and I will take turns carrying you. Goodbye, Mr. Poe. Goodbye, children, Mr. Poe said. If there's any problem, remember you can always contact me or any of my associates as Mortuary Money Management, at least as soon as I get off the helicopter. There's one good thing about the staircase, the doorman joked, starting to walk Mr. Poe back to the front door. It's all uphill from here. The Baudelaire's orphans listened to their doorman's chuckles as he disappeared into the darkness, and they walked up the first few steps. And I'm sure you know the expression, it's all uphill from here. Has nothing to do with walking upstairs. It merely means that things will get better in the future. The children had understood the joke, but they were too anxious to laugh. They were anxious about Count Olaf, who might find them any minute. They were anxious about the Quagmire triplets, whom they might never see again. And now, as they began to walk up this candlelit stairway, they were anxious about their new guardians. They tried to imagine what sort of people would live on such a dark street and such a dark building, and at the top of either 48 or 84 flights of very dark stairs. They found it difficult to believe that things would get better in the future when they lived in such gloomily and poorly lit surroundings. Even though a long upward climb awaited them, and the Baudelaire orphans started walking into the darkness, they were too anxious to believe it was all uphill from here. All right. So, we start off finding out that the Baudelaires get to live in a penthouse apartment, which is really cool. But they're in the darkness because dark is in and light is out, which is kind of a play on words, if you guys remember play on words with the Phantom Tollbooth. So, we're going to see what happens next when they get to the top of the stairs. And hopefully the elevator will be back in eventually. But if you look at the cover of your book, what does that look like to you? I don't know if many of you have been in really, really tall elevators, but that looks like an elevator shaft to me. And the book's called The Ersatz Elevator. So I think it's going to be something to do with that. So watch the next video and figure it out. Also, kids, write in the comments if you want. I miss you guys already. I will see you next time.